containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Good to be here.
We have a very strange, I'd say very volatile collection of books on the desk today.
Volatile's a good word for it. It's a mix that really shouldn't work.
Right. I mean, honestly, if we were in a university library, maybe 1850.
Or even a seminary today.
Yeah, seminary today.
Yeah.
Putting these specific authors next to each other.
Oh, you'd get thrown out.
You'd at least start a shouting match, for sure.
Without a doubt. But that's exactly why this is so interesting.
It is.
We're looking at a topic that usually gets handled with, kid gloves, the origins of Christianity, but we are absolutely taking the gloves off today.
We are indeed. And to set the stage for you, we're anchoring this whole discussion in a specific concept from a scholar named Richard Miller.
Right.
His book is titled Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. And Miller, he does this incredible job of analyzing how this story of the resurrection was, received.
How it was understood by people at the time, how it fit into the sort of cultural landscape.
Exactly. But here's the twist for our deep dive today. We aren't just going to review Miller's book on its own terms.
No, that would be far too easy.
It would.
We're going to take Miller's central question, how is the resurrection received? And we are going to run it through a grinder.
A grinder is right.
We're going to answer that question using the rigorous, controversial, and frankly mind-bending frameworks of two other scholars, Gerald Massey and Martin Bernal.
This is the mission for today. We're doing a really critical examination. You've got the academy view, which is represented by Miller and also by Bart Ehrman, who will bring in as a sort of control variable.
Foil, yeah.
But the heavy lifting, the real work, is going to be done by the revisionists. First up, we have Gerald Massey.
A fascinating figure.
A 19th century poet, a self-taught Egyptologist who wrote these massive tomes, Ancient Egypt and the Natural Genesis.
A man who basically argued that Christianity is not a divine revelation at all, but what he called mythology literalized.
Yeah. Powerful phrase. And then we have Martin Bernal, the 20th century historian behind the absolutely explosive book, Black Athena.
And Bernal argues that the only reason we don't know about the Egyptian roots of our civilization is because of a systematic, racist campaign in the 19th century to erase them.
So that's the tension. It's the standard story of Western civilization versus this radical revisionist view that says the roots of everything, Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, are actually deep in the soil of Africa. We're going to look at the concept of resurrection through Massey and the concept of reception through Bernal. So let's unpack this.
And we really should start by understanding who these two figures are before we apply them. Gerald Massey, he's so interesting because he wasn't part of the academic club.
Not at all.
He was a working-class poet, completely self-educated, writing in the late 1800s. And because he wasn't in the club, he didn't feel any need to follow the club's rules.
So he could say things others couldn't.
Or wouldn't. His core thesis, like I said, is that the gospel story is a retelling of Egyptian astronomical myths, specifically the whole cycle around the god Osiris, which got turned into human history by people who just didn't understand the original symbolism.
He's saying they literally took poetry and turned it into prose. They read a metaphor and thought it was a news report.
That's a perfect way to put it. And then you have Bernal.
Right.
And Martin Bernal is a totally different beast. He was an insider, a respected academic who became an outsider.
By choice.
By choice. His work, Black Athena, it's not really about theology, it's about historiography.
The history of writing history.
Exactly, the history of history itself. His core thesis is that for centuries, the ancient Greeks openly admitted they learned everything. Their gods, their philosophy, architecture, from the Egyptians and the Phoenicians.
Okay, and he calls this what?
He calls it the ancient model. It was just the accepted view. But then, in the 19th century, European scholars, they created what he calls the Aryan model. Well, Bernal's argument is that they just couldn't handle the idea that their pure white European ancestors owed their civilization to Africans and Semites.
So they just scrubbed the history books.
Or bleached it.
Bleached the history. Wow.
Yeah. They essentially replaced the Egyptian and Phoenician roots with a new story about vigorous northern invaders bringing civilization down from the north. So when we look at Richard Miller's topic,
Resurrection,
we have to ask, are we looking at a historical event that happened in Judea, or are we looking at an African myth that was scrubbed, whitewashed, and rewritten by Europeans?
That is a huge question. Let's dive straight into the deep end with Gerald Massey, because when I was reading through his work, especially ancient Egypt, there was one linguistic connection that just stopped me in my tracks.
I think I know which one you mean.
We all know the word Christ. We think we know what it means, the Messiah, the anointed one. But Massey says, hold on, look at the Egyptian. Look at the word charast.
This is one of Massey's most explosive and I think most foundational linguistic connections. It's absolutely crucial for understanding his view of resurrection.
Okay, break it down.
He argues that the very name Christ is derived directly from the Egyptian charast. Now, in the Egyptian mysteries, the charast refers to the mummy.
The actual mummified body.
Yes, but not just any dead body. It's the anointed mummy. It's the body that has been ceremonially prepared for the afterlife.
The embalmed one.
Right. I mean, think about the process. To make a mummy, what do? You anoint the body with oils, with spices, with resins. You are literally christening or anointing the corpse.
So the anointing is the christening.
It's the origin of the concept. Massey points out that in so much Egyptian iconography, you see the hawk, which is the bird of the spirit, of Horus issuing forth from the charast mummy.
Right.
That image that represents the preservation of the personality in death. The charast is the prototype of the Christ, the anointed one who conquers death by being preserved through it.
And he connects this to Christian theology in a way that it's just kind of mind-blowing. He brings up the Apostle Paul. Paul talks about putting on Christ like it's a piece of clothing. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. I mean, I always read that as a metaphor.
Of course.
For acting like Jesus, taking on his qualities.
And Massey says, no, take it literally. Look at the Egyptian ritual.
Okay.
When a body was mummified, it was wrapped in a very specific bandage called the swath without a seam. It was this incredibly long, continuous strip of linen.
A single piece.
A single, seamless piece. Massey argues that when Paul talks about putting on Christ, he is using the direct imagery of the mummy. You are being wrapped in the charast. You are putting on the immortality of the mummy to ensure your own resurrection.
And the swath without a seam
becomes the seamless robe of Jesus found in the gospel. It's a direct survival of the imagery.
So the argument here is that the theology isn't new at all. It's just Egyptian funerary ritual that's been repurposed. But Massey goes further than just words, right? He goes after the entire biography of Jesus. He basically says there is no history here. It's all just Egyptian mystery.
He is a mythicist in the absolute strictest sense of the word. He believes the historical Jesus is a fundamental misunderstanding of the mythical Horus.
The Egyptian god?
The Egyptian god of the rising sun, the son of Isis and Osiris. And he lays out these specific parallels, he calls them types or prototypes, that are, they're honestly difficult to ignore once you see them laid out.
All right, let's hit some of those nuggets then. This is the core of it. Let's start with the big one. The virgin birth.
Right. This is foundational for both myths. Massey traces this to the Egyptian house of birth. In their astronomical myth, the sun, which is Horus, is born from the Virgin Mother, who is Isis, or sometimes Neith, in the celestial sign of Virgo, the Virgin.
So it's an astrological event first.
It's an astronomical, astrological drama. But Massey points out it's not just about a story, it's about the physical artifacts that survived. He points to the Roman Church and something called the Black Bambino.
Yeah, I saw this in the notes. These are actual statues in Italy of a black baby Jesus and a black Mary.
Exactly. A jeweled image of a black child, sacredly preserved for centuries. Massey says that is the direct survival of the cult of the child Horus.
How so?
Horus was often called the Kamite Christ. Kamite meaning from Kemet or Egypt, which means the black land, referring to the fertile black soil of the Nile.
Okay.
Horus was often depicted as black, representing the sun in the underworld or the fertility that comes from the dark soil. So the Black Bambino in Rome, it's a direct holdover. It's the Egyptian icon that got Christianized.
So the reception, to use Miller's term again.
The reception here was the church receiving the icon but completely forgetting or maybe suppressing its source.
Okay, what about the miracles? Because that feels very different. Massey seems to think even the miracles are just retellings of the Book of the Dead.
He does. Let's take the raising of Lazarus. That is a huge, dramatic moment in the Gospels. Jesus goes to the town of Bethany, finds Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and calls him out of the tomb. It feels so specific, so historical.
It does. It feels like an eyewitness account. And Massey just deconstructs it piece by piece, both linguistically and mythologically.
Go on.
He says, first, look at the name Lazarus. In Egyptian, the name for the god Osiris is Ezar.
Okay, Ezar.
But when you add the definite article the, as in the Osiris, it becomes Eleazar.
Eleazar.
Through various dialects and transmissions, that phrase shifts towards Lazarus.
Yeah.
Now think about the myth. Who is Osiris?
He's the god who dies and is brought back.
Right, but more specifically, he's the inert god. He's the mummy waiting in the underworld in Amenta. And in the myth, who is it that wakes him up, who calls him back to life?
His son, Horus.
His son, Horus.
So Jesus is Horus and Lazarus is Osiris.
Precisely. Massey links Lazarus directly to the Egyptian concept of the inert Osiris the mummy, whom the son Horus comes to awaken. And then look at the location. Bethany. What about it?
Massey connects it to the Egyptian Beth-Anu.
Bethany.
Exactly. Beth-Anu in Egyptian means the house of Anu. And Anu was the city we know as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. It was the primary place of reckoning for the dead in Egyptian theology.
So you're saying the story of Lazarus isn't a historical account of a man stepping out of a cave in Judea?
That's Massey's argument. He says it's a dramatization of the soul, Horus, calling the inert body, Osiris, back to life in the spiritual house of the sun. It's an eschatological drama, not a newspaper report.
He does the exact same thing with the miraculous draft of fishes, right? The story where the disciples can't catch anything, Jesus tells them where to cast their nets, and they pull in this huge catch.
Yes. In the Gospels, it's a fishing trip that becomes a miracle. But in the Egyptian ritual, what we call the Book of the Dead, catching fish is a deeply symbolic act that takes place in the underworld.
In Amenta.
In Amenta, yes. The fishers in the ritual are spiritual beings who save souls, who catch them from the waters of oblivion. Massey argues that the gospel writers took a scene from the ritual where the god Sebek, or sometimes Horus, catches souls in a marvelous net, and they turned it into a literal fishing miracle on the Sea of Galilee.
And he has that great line.
Mythology knows nothing of miracle.
Right, mythology knows nothing of miracle. What does he mean by that?
He means that in the original myth, these things are symbols. A miracle is what happens when you tell a myth to someone who doesn't understand the symbolism.
So they think it defies physics.
When really it was just trying to describe metaphysics,
Yeah.
a spiritual reality, not a physical one.
You know, it also explains some of the truly bizarre details in the Gospels. There's this strange verse in the Gospel of Mark, and it's only in Mark where Jesus is arrested in the garden.
The young man in linen.
Yeah, this young man is following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. The guards grab at him, and he just leaves the cloth behind and runs away completely naked.
It's so random.
It has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why on earth is that detail there? It feels so out of place.
And then a naked guy ran away. It makes no narrative sense.
Right.
But Massey says, again, look at the Egyptian ritual. When the deceased spirit, the soul, finally rises from the mummy.
Right.
It sheds its mummy bandages, the linen wrappings. The primary undergarment was called the shenti. The spirit flies off naked, free of its earth garment, leaving the linen behind.
So the young man in Mark is a symbol.
Massey argues that the young man is a fragment of the original mystery play. It's the soul shedding the mummy cloth to rise in the afterlife. The gospel writer included it as a quirky historical detail, but it was originally a profound spiritual symbol of resurrection.
So if we take all of this and we apply Massey's criteria to Richard Miller's topic resurrection, what is the final verdict?
The verdict is that resurrection was never, ever meant to be understood as a physical human coming back to life on Earth.
It was an eschatological drama.
It was an eschatological drama, exactly. It was about the soul, the Horus spirit rising from the inert body, the Osiris mummy, in Amenta, the Egyptian underworld.
And what we think of as history.
The historic mockery, as Massey calls it, happened when these spiritual dramas were turned into a literal biography of a Judean peasant.
Historic mockery. He really doesn't pull his punches.
He does not. He believes that what we have now is, in his words, the leavings of the past. We're worshiping the husks of a fruit whose juice we have completely lost.
Which brings us perfectly to our second lens. Because if Massey is right, and that is a very big if, we have to keep saying that.
Huge if.
But if he is right, how did we lose the Jews? How did an entire civilization forget that this was all Egyptian? And this is where Martin Bernal steps in with Black Athena.
Right. It's the logical next question. Massey tells us what the myths are, Bernal tells us why we forgot them.
And Bernal's answer is not a comfortable one.
Not at all. His answer is racism.
He talks about something he calls the sociology of knowledge.
Yes. And that's really the core of his work. Bernal asks a simple question. Why do we study Greece as the pure childhood of Europe? Why do we start the story of Western civilization with the Greeks?
It's just what we're taught.
It is. But he contrasts two models to explain why. First, what he calls the ancient model.
Okay.
This is what the ancient Greeks themselves believed. You read Herodotus, you read Plato, Diodorus Siculus. They all openly admitted it. They said, hey, our ancestors were wild and uncivilized until the Egyptians and the Phoenicians came here and taught us about the gods and geometry and how to build cities.
So the Greeks themselves were proud of their connection to Egypt.
They revered it. They saw Egypt as the source of all ancient wisdom. It was the respectable thing to do to trace your lineage or your knowledge back to Egypt.
But then something changed.
Something changed drastically. Bernal introduces the Aryan model. This was developed primarily in the 19th century in Germany and then in England right around the 1840s and 50s.
So at the same time Massey is writing, more or less.
It's exactly the same environment. And this is the era of high European imperialism, the era of so-called scientific racism.
Right.
And it became intolerable, that is the word Bernal implies, for the Romantic Europeans to accept that their pure Greek ancestors, the founders of democracy and logic and beauty, were civilized by Africans who were the Egyptians or Semites who were the Phoenicians.
They needed a white European origin story.
They needed one desperately, and so they invented the Northern invasion.
Which is the idea of that.
They decided, despite having literally no evidence for it in the ancient texts, that vigorous Northern invaders, who they called Indo-Europeans or Aryans, must have swept down into Greece from the north and imposed civilization on the primitive natives.
So they flipped the map.
They completely flipped the map. They couldn't accept that culture flowed from south to north, from Africa to Europe. It absolutely had to flow from north to south.
But how did they get away with it? I mean, how do you just erase Egypt when, as you said, Herodotus is right there in the library?
They used a very clever and very destructive academic toolset. They used something called the argument from silence and a new skeptical form of source criticism.
How did that work?
Well, if Herodotus said Egyptians colonized the city of Thebes in Greece, the 19th century scholars, like a very famous one named Karl Ottfried Müller, would just say, well, Herodotus was gullible. He was just listening to bragging Egyptian priests. It's a late fabrication, a delusion.
So they just dismissed the primary sources.
They dismissed them as unreliable if and only if they pointed to Afro-Asiatic influence.
Wow.
They also relabeled everything. They stopped calling the early inhabitants of Greece colonies of Egypt and started calling them pre-Hellenic or Pelasgian, vague terms that cut the cord to the east.
And they invented an impermeable dark age.
Yes, to suggest that even if there was some contact in the Bronze Age, it was all destroyed and forgotten, and the Greeks had to start again, fresh and pure, on their own.
So let's bring this back to our topic, resurrection. If Bernal is right about all this, then the entire academic environment that Richard Miller or even Bart Ehrman grew up in was constructed from the ground up to exclude Egypt.
That is the crucial insight from Bernal. When a modern scholar, a mainstream scholar, analyzes the concept of resurrection, they are trained to look at Jewish sources.
Right, the Old Testament.
They're trained to look at Hellenistic, so Greek sources. But because of the dominance of the Aryan model for the last 150 years, looking at Egyptian sources for the origins of Christian ideas is considered fringe.
It's seen as pseudoscience.
It is. The academy, in Bernal's view, was built on a foundation of systematically erasing the Afro-Asiatic roots. So from within that system, Massey looks like a conspiracy theorist.
But Bernal would argue.
Bernal would argue Massey is just seeing what was obvious to everyone before the 19th century racists scrubbed the record clean.
That is a very heavy realization. It means this deep dive isn't just about learning new facts. It's about unlearning a bias that most of us probably didn't even know we had.
Yep.
But we have to be fair. We have to bring in the voice of the academy. We have Bart Ehrman in the stack.
Yeah.
And he is, well, he's not buying the whole Jesus is a myth thing.
No, he is certainly not. And it's really important to understand his position because Bart Ehrman represents the best of established mainstream historical scholarship on this.
And he does acknowledge the mythicists.
He does. He knows they exist. He mentions authors who follow in Massey's intellectual footsteps like Freke and Gandhi or Akaria S. But he He dismisses them pretty forcefully.
He calls the parallels that Massey points out coincidental or made up, right?
He does. Ehrman's main line of attack is against the dying rising god theory. Now, this was a popular idea in the early 20th century from scholars like Sir James Frazer, who wrote The Golden Bough.
Right. The idea that all these ancient gods, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, they were all just vegetation gods who died in the winter and rose in the spring, and Jesus was just the Jewish version of that.
That's the one. And Ehrman argues that this entire category is now defunct in modern scholarship. He cites scholars like Mettinger and Jonathan Z. Smith, who say there is no unambiguous evidence that pagans believed in dying and rising gods in the same way Christians believed in Jesus.
So he's focusing on the distinctions. He's saying, sure, Osiris rose to become king of the underworld, but he didn't physically come back to Earth and eat fish with his friends.
Exactly. Ehrman insists on the details. He'll argue that the earliest Christians, like Paul, viewed the resurrection as a one-time apocalyptic event, the start of the end of the world, not a cyclical, repeating agricultural myth.
And he also fights for the historical Paul.
Right.
The mythicists often claim Paul never talks about a historical Jesus.
And Ehrman argues very strongly that Paul does quote Jesus and does know him as a recent historical figure. He says the mythicists are just misreading or ignoring the evidence in the epistles.
So we have a complete standoff. Let's try to synthesize this. What does this conflict actually look like when you put them side by side?
Well, let's just look at the data points as each side sees them. Massey says the parallels, the virgin birth, the miracles, the 12 followers, the linguistic link of Christ to Christ, are undeniable and overwhelming. He says the probability of all these things happening to a historical Jesus by pure coincidence is effectively zero.
And Ehrman's response.
Ehrman says the parallels are either made up or they're superficial. He says we have no ancient record of Osiris being born on December 25th. We have no record of him being crucified in the way Jesus was. He argues that Massey and his followers are parallelomaniacs. They're pattern-matching things that don't actually fit.
It's a classic case of seeing what you want to see.
That's Ehrman's charge. He argues Massey is myth-hunting. He's just looking for any connection and willfully ignoring all the differences.
But then Martin Bernal is standing in the corner watching this entire fight. What does he say?
And this is where it gets so interesting. Bernal provides the context for the fight itself. Bernal would argue that Ehrman is, for lack of a better term, sleepwalking within the Aryan model.
He's a product of the system.
He's a product of a system built to exclude this data. Ehrman is demanding unambiguous evidence for Egyptian influence. But Bernal's whole point is that the very standards of evidence were set up in the 19th century to disqualify Egypt from the start.
So when Ehrman says the consensus of scholars rejects this,
Bernal would ask which scholars? The ones trained in a university system that was designed from the ground up to prove Greek and European superiority. Is that the consensus you mean?
that is the absolute kicker. It's not just about the facts. It's about the framework you are using to interpret the facts.
Right, and that's what makes this so difficult. If you accept the Aryan model as your starting point, Massey is a crank. There's no way around it.
But if you accept Bernal's argument and go with the ancient model,
Then Massey looks like a pioneer, a man who spotted the deep connections that the entire academic establishment was conspiring, consciously or not, to hide.
let's move to the last part of this. We've talked a lot about the resurrection. Now let's talk about reception. This is the second half of Richard Miller's title. How was this story received by people at the time?
Okay, and if we use Massey to analyze reception, we get a fascinating split in the early church. Massey argues, and Bernal's work supports this to an extent, that the Gnostics were the ones who received the myth correctly.
The Gnostics, these were the early Christian groups who claimed to have secret knowledge, the gnosis.
Exactly. And Massey says their secret knowledge was that they preserved the true link to the Egyptian mysteries. They knew the gospel story wasn't literal history. They understood that the Christ was the spiritual Horus within the soul. They kept the mysteries as spiritual mysteries.
And the literalizers, who were they?
That would be the group that eventually became the Roman Church, the Orthodox tradition. Massey argues they were the ones who carnalized the myth.
Carnalized, meaning they made it fleshly, historical.
Precisely. They took the spiritual drama that was set in the Amenta, the Egyptian underworld, and they mapped it onto the physical geography of Judea. They took the spiritual supper of Osiris and turned it into a historical Last Supper in an upper room in Jerusalem.
Massey talks specifically about the agape feast and the Eucharist, doesn't he?
He does. He traces both the agape, which was the love feast, and the Eucharist, the communion, back to Osirian mysteries. The Egyptians celebrated the Last Supper of Osiris on the final night of the old year. Massey argues that the Gnostics kept these double feasts as symbolic rituals.
But Paul and the later church,
They tried to separate them, formalize them, and most importantly, turn them into a memorial for a specific dead man, rather than a timeless spiritual symbol of continuity and rebirth.
and then there's the other side of reception. Not just how it was received then, but how is this Egyptian hypothesis received today?
Poorly. Very, very poorly. And Bernal's work explains exactly why. He talks about the concept of the stolen legacy, which was also the title of a book by George G.M. James.
And the idea there is,
The idea is that there is a deep systemic resistance to the notion that Greek philosophy, and by extension Christian theology, was plundered from Egypt.
people want to believe it.
They don't. Bernal notes that even when the archaeology seems to back up the ancient legends, like when they find Semitic or Egyptian artifacts in ancient Greek cities, modern scholars will bend over backward to find an autochthonous explanation.
Autochthonous meaning it grew here locally. It just sprang up on its own.
Right. They would rather believe in a miraculous local invention of complex culture than admit that the Africans or the Semites brought it there. It's a deep-seated refusal to give credit where, Bernal argues, credit is due.
So we've traveled from the mummies of Egypt and the Book of the Dead all the way to the lecture halls of 19th century Germany and now to the modern debates on the internet and in academia.
It is quite a journey, and it shows how a single idea can be refracted through so many different lenses.
Let's try to wrap this up with a final thought. If we take Massey and Bernal seriously, even just for the sake of the thought experiment, what does it ultimately do to our understanding of resurrection and reception?
It changes the definition of everything. I mean, if Massey is right, history, as we know it in the Gospels, is a fundamental mistake. It's a misunderstanding of poetry as prose. The resurrection wasn't a man walking out of a tomb in 33 AD. It was an eternal symbol of the soul surviving death, which got confused for a news report.
And if Bernal is right?
Well, if Bernal is right, then our history books aren't just mistaken. They are purposely biased. They were actively rewritten to flatter a European self-image. It implies that the entire Western world has been suffering from a kind of collective, self-imposed amnesia for 200 years, suppressing its own parentage.
That leads to a pretty provocative conclusion then. Maybe the resurrection we should be talking about isn't just about Jesus in the tomb.
I think that is the real aha moment here, isn't it? Perhaps the real resurrection for our time is the resurrection of the ancient model itself.
Say more about that.
It's about bringing back the forgotten Afro-Asiatic roots of Western civilization. It's about resurrecting the truth that was buried, mummified, if you will, by 19th century scholarship.
That is a powerful image. The truth was wrapped in the swathe without a seam of academic bias, and now people like Bernal and Massey are trying to unwrap it.
And maybe, just like that young man in the Gospel of Mark, the truth needs to run away naked stripped of the artificial bandages of history to be seen for what it really is.
So here's our challenge to you, the listener, after this deep dive. The next time you read a history book, or you listen to a lecture on the glories of Western civilization, or even when you read the Gospels, just ask yourself one question. Who built the model I'm using?
Am I reading the history of what actually happened?
Or am I reading the Aryan version of events?
It's a question that really does change everything.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.